Kitco Mining's special coverage of the Deutsche Goldmesse is brought to you by Victoria Gold.
Copper's time is coming. This is Paul Harris for Kitco Mining at the Deutsche Goldmesse in Frankfurt, Germany. Joining me to discuss this is Rick Trotman, President and CEO of Barksdale Resources. Rick, welcome to Kitco.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
Now, the copper price has been quite stagnant this year, despite a very bullish outlook. What's going on with the copper price?
Yeah, there are a couple of different things in my opinion. You've got folks worried in the kind of first world nations about the economies, right? So in the United States and Canada, most of Europe, people are afraid that at some point we're going to be going into a recession because of all these rate hikes that we've been seeing. So I think people are kind of in a risk-off attitude right now, and that's obviously hitting the copper price. It's not falling as if we were, in a recession outright, but it's just kind of sitting at a, kind of a 370 type price. And I think it probably will for quite some time, even though, as you mentioned, the long-term projections for supply are not looking great.
Now, $3.70, $3.50 a pound is historically a very high level, and the copper producers, the major copper producers, making very good profits at these levels. So it's far from being a disaster.
Yeah. I think their margins have been squeezed a bit by inflationary pressure, but overall they're making money. And I think that's great. Now, luckily for most of the copper explorers out there, the copper developers out there, the copper price isn't high enough to really justify gigantic new builds out there in the world of copper, right? There's some very high quality, high grade type operations have come online here in the past year or two, but those marginal assets, they're really not getting pushed through that capital phase because copper prices aren't high enough yet. So that's good from a supply standpoint, because we're not going to see a ton of supply coming on in the next couple of years because those investments aren't being made right now. So I think from a kind of 2 to 5 year setup, this is perfect. Obviously, we'd love the prices to be a little bit more buoyant right now, and for investors really to come back into the space. But I think this is setting itself up well for the next couple of years.
It has been a very interesting year in terms of some of the things that are happening in the broader copper space. Most recently, the headlines are being dominated by the situation in Panama. First Quantum's Copper Panama mine. Will it or won't it continue to operate? That's a 400,000 ton a year operation. That's 1 or 2% of world copper production. So if that stops, that'll be a major thing. But also continuing cost overruns at Teck Resources QB2 mine. I want to start there. It was originally, I think, a $3.4, $3.5 billion development project. Now it's up to $8.6, $8.8 billion. Is that kind of cost overrun scaring away investors and scaring away developers?
I think so. I mean, you have this background of inflation, and that hits everything in mining, from the steel that they use to build things to the cost of engineers that ultimately work on the designs, and the workers, obviously, that build these things. But then you have the unknowns. So in Teck's case, the Chilean government, right? So they were looking to permit a certain piece of that development strategy, and it looked like the permits were not going to be granted, and so Teck pulled those permits. And I think a part of those costs increase are delays that they're planning, because they now have to kind of go back to the drawing board on some of those permits. Exactly. And then, redesign, re-engineer, re-permit, and that process takes time, and time costs money for these big mining companies. So I think some of those governmental unknowns, that's where things are getting a bit tricky, right? So people are flocking towards first world countries, unless the ore deposits are just so, wonderfully endowed that they're willing to take the risk. I don't think anybody's looking to build anything in Argentina today, right? Or obviously no new Panamanian, copper projects are going to get built in the next, short while. So, yeah.
Well, and perhaps never, because I was reading last night on Twitter, the president of Panama has passed a law that says no more. No more mining permits, no more mining concessions, nothing more. Sticking with Panama, one thing that says to me that we're not in a copper super cycle yet is the fact that the copper prices haven't spiked on this. If you go back 15 years in the super cycle, any rumor of a threat to production interruptions at Escondida or Collahuasi or one of the other big mines would send the copper price spiking up 10, 20, 30, 50 cents. That hasn't happened. Why isn't that happening, do you think?
My personal opinion is that people don't think Cobre Panama is going to shut down for the long term. I think that whether a deal is struck with the company that runs it, or whether or not the government takes over the mine and sells it off to the Chinese or whoever, or they run it themselves, I think it represents such a large percentage of their workforce, such a big percentage of their national GDP. I don't think that mine's going to be offline for very long. Obviously, the blockades, they're going to force First Quantum to probably slow things down, if not turn it off. But is that going to be a couple of month pause, or is that going to be something that lasts several years? I would err on the side of a couple of months.
Okay, you mentioned a moment ago about incentive price. The incentive price isn't there yet. As we also mentioned, $3.50 a pound is historically a very high level for the copper price. What do you think is the realistic incentive price for companies to greenlight the development of new production today?
Yeah, I would say for average grade deposits, the incentive price is going to be north of $4. Yeah, maybe even $4.25 these days. If you have a special project, like, any one of Robert Friedland's projects, things that have high grades, some of those new discoveries down in Argentina, for instance, that, have really high grade components, maybe the incentive price is a bit lower on those, but I would say in that $4 to $4.25 type range.
I had a very enlightening conversation with Robert Friedland last week about the Makoko discovery. Lots of expletives, but very interesting. Another great discovery he's got there, high grade, and looks like it's going to be massive. The Western Forelands copper belt looks like it's going to be a major one well into the future. But let's bring the conversation around to your projects. You're exploring in Arizona in the United States and in, I think it's Sonora in Mexico. Let's start with Sunnyside. You're adjacent to South 32 Somoza project. You're drilling there, or the judge recently ruled that you can drill, and you've started drilling there. Bring us up to date with what's happening at Sunnyside.
Yeah, so we have 2 drills operating on the project right now, heading down towards the first targets. Drilling's been a little slower than we ever anticipated. Just the geology that we're drilling through is a bit trickier than expected. So anyway, the drilling is advancing. We're getting closer to those targets, and hopefully here soon, touch wood, we'll be into that carbonate platform and into the first couple of real massive sulfide type intercepts, and that's what we've been looking for.
And your targets there are down dip of is it the Taylor deposit that South 32's got? So the same structure, just the other side of the property boundary.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a big carbonate platform that dips towards us, and we're just looking for the rest of it, so to speak. Yeah.
Okay, what about San Javier in Mexico? You published a maiden resource a year ago. What have you been up to since then?
Yeah, so we've been working on a preliminary economic study on that project. I've got a copy of it on my computer right now that I've been going through, kind of that first edition. So hopefully the rest of the document looks good, and if so, then we'll start working on press releases and kind of getting that out to the market here in the near short term.
So before the end of the year?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I mean, as you mentioned, the sort of timing is often very critical to these things, and the copper price seems to be reviving and showing some signs of life again lately. So it could be a good time to be bringing out good news like that.
Yeah, I think so. And then, Mexico, has its issues as well. And I think the presidential election coming up here next year, I think that's really going to swing the tide in Mexico when it comes to kind of new mine development. And so having a project like San Javier, which is our copper project, which is a kind of development stage copper project, I think we're going into that right time because people are going to start looking at Mexico as an opportunity again. And having the inventory of projects down there is going to be, that's where you want to be. You want to have the project, you want to be looking for a project when that new president comes in.
Give us your take on Mexico. The Mexican president gets a lot of press for his anti-mining comments, yet projects are getting permits. Torex got a key permit recently, and under the current president, the income Mexico's received from mining is far and above anything his predecessors have ever received. So mining is a success story under AMLO. And yet obviously his rhetoric is often against the mining sector. Well, what's the real deal there?
Yeah, I think the rules that they have in place are focused more towards the existing mining operations than they are towards incentivizing new ones to come online. So Torex is already operating there, obviously, and so that new permit, I view that as kind of a bolt-on. Effectively, they have people employed, they're spending money, they're getting their permits, whereas kind of these exploration and development type properties, that's where the uncertainty lies, right? And so companies that are looking to do work in Mexico that don't already have that foothold there, that's where the hesitation really comes into play. And that's what's stopping new entrants from coming in and kind of buoying the price of projects and getting that whole market kind of going from a excitement standpoint.
Well, Rick, we're on the verge of 2024. What do you think will happen next year in the copper space, and what would you like to see happen?
Oh, well, I think that we're going to see some big M&A, quite honestly. I think the number of, obviously, besides Robert Friedland, the number of discoveries is going down yet again. And I think that the cupboards are starting to look bare for some of these larger companies. So I think we're going to go into a phase of M&A here shortly.
Well, let's hope so. Rick, thank you very much for joining us today.
Of course, thanks for having me.
And this is Paul Harris for Kitco Mining at Deutsche Goldmesse in Frankfurt, Germany. And if you like what you see, don't forget to subscribe.
Kitco Mining's special coverage of the Deutsche Goldmesse is brought to you by Victoria Gold.